Thank you, Jim. Good morning, everyone. Pleasure to be here. While this is booting up, yes, this is my third talk. Some of you have been in the previous two, some of you have not. I have always been interested in this, but especially this topic, serving the needy. Mostly got concentrated during my training in inner city Charlotte at the height of the AIDS epidemic. I had the unfortunate pleasure of being trained at the peak of the AIDS epidemic and at the peak of emptying out our mental institutions for people to try and fend for themselves. So, well, that's interesting. Let me try this. Technology. Yeah, just a little story real quick. When I was an intern in Charlotte in 1994, in January, a lot of the homeless men would come in the emergency room when it was really cold outside and complain of chest pain because they knew that legally we were going to have to keep them overnight and do a cardiac workup to make sure they weren't having a heart attack. And they got 3 hot meals and a nice nurse. And this was back before all the rooms were private, so we had one room with 6 beds. So we'd have 3 guys on one side and 3 at the other, and they'd be yelling at each other all night long. And so after their workups were negative, meaning, okay, it's not your heart, you can go, nobody wanted to go. So here I am as an intern escorting homeless men down to the front door out of the hospital with security guards. Now, you would probably never see that today because no hospital would want anybody filming that with their iPhone being in the media. But just kind of illustrates, the links that people will go to and kind of the situation we're in. It's only gotten worse since then. So at any rate, that's just a little opening story. But let's start talking about the 3 ministries of the church. And we've mentioned this before. We'll keep reiterating because it's good to be reminded. The 3 ministries of the church really are to minister to God, which we do as a body when we come and worship in public. And we give him glory and honor that he is due. The second ministry that we have as believers is to each other. Come alongside each other. We publicly affirm our faith. We encourage each other to continue to follow Christ, being his disciples. We serve each other in practical ways. Here at CTK, we have the Deacons Fund, and if some of our folks are in need, we have funds, fortunately, because you all are very generous. We have funds available to help take care of each other. But the third ministry we have is really to the world. I guess it's going to keep timing out. And that's the part that can be a little tricky, especially in 2026 and while we're having these talks. Now, for the sake of time, I'm not going to go through all these scriptures. We could, and at some point we may, go through all these scriptures to show you sort of the background for each of these particular ministries that we have: ministry to God, ministry to each other, and ministry to the poor. But let's focus right now on ministry to the world. There are a couple ways that we can minister to the world, and one is that we, the leadership, I'm not part of leadership, but part of the Mercy Outreach team, the leadership can train you all how to serve the world, because we live in a complex society where poverty is a lot more difficult to tackle than, say, it used to be 100, 200, or 1,000 years ago. So that's part of equipping the saints that comes along with being in a public church like this. So we have the Mercy Outreach team, which is composed of Blake. Jim started it. Jim, is Jim in here now? Jim stepped out. Jim started that. I will get to that history in a bit. Virginia's serves. Randy serves. Erica Penny helped start it. My wife serves. Holly Burris serves. Blake and Holly over here serve. So we get together on a bi-monthly basis, and we talk about this stuff and pray about it. And I'll get to more later about what we actually do. But what I wanted to do at this point in the talk is really define what is mercy ministry. Well, it's not difficult. It's caring for the needy. But in a biblical sense, it's caring for the needy with an asterisk attached. And for CTK, wanting to be biblically based, it's ministering to the poor with the gospel attached to it. And that's the key. And that sometimes can be the more difficult part because it can be easier just giving to the poor without attaching the gospel. But we want to be gospel based, and we'll get to that more. Mercy ministry reflects God's heart and character because he first reached out to us. And so we want to reach out to the world because we're simply reflecting what God has already done with us through his Son. And that includes not just the weak and the vulnerable, but it can also include people, possibly enemies. When I say enemy, what I mean, folks who just will flat out reject the gospel, or in this day and age, folks who would see Jesus as an adversarial figure. And therefore, if you identify with him, you are also adversarial. But we see in the Gospels that Jesus really reached out to all members of society, not just the Jews. So I don't necessarily have to make that case because I think you're all familiar with that. His actions with all members across society. And that's one of the privileges that folks like Tim Pattison, Andrew Barton, Jake Schaefer, and myself, as people that work in a public hospital, and I'm not trying to single out just physicians who work at hospitals. Some of you may do this as well. We have the honor and privilege to work with the most poor to the multimillionaires and everywhere in between. So we're constantly interacting with people of all different socioeconomic classes. And we get to see and get to know those classes and get to understand patterns, which is, again, it's a privilege. So mercy ministry, which is reaching out to the community with the gospel, is something, I mean, we have people, and a lot of you yourselves are involved in civic activities. The way you vote, maybe you're on some governmental committee or something like that. as believers, unfortunately, we have a lot of believers who are sort of embedded in society, impacting civic activities, for instance, like policies on abortion or how we take care of the mentally ill, etc. But I would argue that that alone doesn't satisfy our charge to minister to the poor as a church. And so we want to be involved in mercy ministry as a particular CTK church. The problem is a lot of churches can get involved in mercy ministry, and the pendulum swings too far because we're Americans and we like extremes, don't we? Or it seems that's been my observation. We go from one extreme to the other. So we may reach out and do a mercy ministry, but it becomes over time sort of a social ministry because we don't want to offend people with the gospel. Or Jesus is offensive to some. Well, he's offensive to us all. We all have to stumble over him because we're stumbling over our sin. So it's sometimes easier to eliminate the gospel and just morph into a social mercy ministry. On the other hand, we have some churches that just will do evangelism, but they have no practical outreach to the needy. And so that pendulum tends to swing too far on either side, and we need a healthy balance. And that's the tricky part. As an example, several years ago, we were approached as a mercy outreach team, there was an organization in town that was accepting Middle Eastern refugees, but they wanted us to take, and sponsor a refugee family or couple or what have you, but they didn't want us to proselytize. And so we were interested in exploring the possibility of sponsoring refugees, but we're not going to get ourselves involved with something that's going to say, but don't talk about Jesus. That's our identity. That's our DNA. That's who we are. And we never want to lose that. So that's just kind of an example of how this pendulum can swing. Mercy ministry should not silence Christian witness. It should be the foundation for the ministry. So now, in my previous talks, we've talked about a history of taking care of the poor in North Carolina because a lot of you are new to this talk. I'm going to just briefly go over it because it'll help you understand why we are the way we are. How many people in this room, show of hands, were raised outside of North Carolina? Ooh, okay. That's more than I thought it was going to be. All right. Wow. Okay. Well, North Carolina was, like Georgia, the poorest of the original 13 colonies. We were a different colony. We were not a royal colony that was controlled by the King of England with his royal governors. We were controlled by his loyal aristocracy that helped him defeat Oliver Cromwell during the English Civil War. So there were, I think, 8 Lord Proprietors that were assigned to that the king gave North Carolina, which at the time it was just the Carolina colony. There was no North and South Carolina. Gave the colony to these 8 lords, and they were to get it inhabited, get it farmed, start making money, and give taxes to the king, and they got to keep the rest. The problem was the climate was so harsh. We were so poor. We had no infrastructure. We attracted yeoman farmers who worked off their indentured servitude coming through Jamestown up in Virginia. They came here penniless. They just became subsistence tobacco, cotton farmers, and there was no rule of law, so they had to fight for themselves. So basically, we were perennially behind any other colony in terms of governance or infrastructure, what have you. Our first public schools did not open for 200 years after the first public school in Boston. So that kind of puts things in perspective. And you may say, well, good, I don't like public schools. But recall, I mean, back then, this is when public schools taught you how to read by reading the Bible, okay? So back then, public school was a lot different than it is now, but that's just an example of trying to show you, you move to a beautiful state. It is beautiful, and we have a lot of positive attributes, but we have some baggage, and we're still dealing with it. So the way that we took care of the poor back then was not through church ministries. The church here was never really organized. We were taxed. Those North Carolinians were taxed. They had to pay a tax to the Church of England, but they weren't Anglican or Episcopal members. We were evangelized by the Baptists and the Methodists because the Presbyterians were too snobby to come here. I say that in jest, but that's actually true. If you go outside of Wilmington 30 minutes, most of the churches that you will see are Baptists and Methodists because they're the ones that would come to the poor colony and evangelize with their circuit riding, etc. We did have Presbyterians that went to Charlotte. Charlotte's the number 2 banking capital center in the country. I guess Presbyterians are good at managing money. And we had Quakers coming down as well who were very education and anti-slavery oriented. So we had their influence for a while. But they lost their influence when they wouldn't fight for the revolution because they were pacifists. So what happened was churches were not involved in taking care of the poor because they were too poor and they were too disorganized. There were a couple of orphanages that the Methodists did later on, but those were segregated. The Black citizens, they had to raise their own funds and open their own orphanage up in the Oxford area, north of Raleigh, Greensboro area. The Methodists opened theirs in Raleigh. But basically, the way we took care of the poor was by county. Each county had its own poor house or almshouse. And you had every range of poor person in there, from the orphan to the elderly widowed, to the totally uncontrollable mentally ill person chained to the floor. And so each respected man in the county had to take his turn for 1 year taking care of the almshouse. And if you didn't, you were going to get fined. So each of us would have to pony up and then do a year taking care or supervising the poorhouse. And then as the Civil War ensued, and we got beyond that, the state started to develop in governance more, and we moved from being a county-run system based on English common poor laws to having the state go from inspecting orphanages and poorhouses to then having the state tax the North Carolina systems to create systems of managing the poor. And then after the Civil Rights Act in the 60s, we morphed more into a federal control administration of dollars for poor folks. I was telling Jim before this, a lot of folks, just to give you an example of the federal involvement, medical doctors, most of us train on poor people. That's sort of our dirty little secret in America. We go and a lot of the hospitals we train in are poor inner city hospitals, and Medicare pays for our salaries. So that's just kind of one example of how the federal government is involved in taking care of the poor. And we've transitioned from county-centric administration of taking care of the poor to state to federal. Now it's a total combination of all three. So you have all these governmental organizations involved with a lot of interplay. And add to that another complex layer, and that is the segregation factor that occurred here for several hundred years until the Civil Rights Act. It really wasn't until Medicare was formed in 1965 that hospitals and society in general were forced to desegregate in a cultural way. So, like, for instance, Tammy was a forced bus student. She was forced to go from Greenville Loop Road all the way down to New Hanover High School. Fortunately for me, because that's how I met her. Because I lived a few blocks away from here, so I would just walk to school. So I never would have met Tammy if it wasn't for forced desegregation. But like when we had our original hospital, the James Walker Hospital, over here a few blocks, the black people had to go through in the back door. Couldn't go in the front door, and they had their own section. And the black doctors weren't allowed to come in and take care of their patients. They had a black hospital over by Williston that had like 25 beds, I think. And the black doctors could take care of their patients over there, and they also had a black nursing school. That's all been demolished, and very few people know about that anymore. But the black doctors, if the patient was really sick, would have to transfer them over to the county hospital, where the white doctor would take over the care in the black ward. And then later, when our present hospital was built, the tower was built in '67. That was a couple years after Medicare was passed. And so then we became desegregated. Why am I talking about all this medical stuff? Because poor people need health care. If you don't have health care, you have a broken bone and it's not treated properly, you have a heart condition or whatever, you can't work. If you can't work, you're going to be poor. So it's a critical piece of ministering to the poor. And I'm trying to paint what you have moved into, what we're inheriting, and what we have to sort of sort through. Okay. And then let me back up. So I forgot about this. So in 1935, we had the Social Security Act. That helped us take care of our elderly poor, which was a huge problem up until that point. And it still is to some degree with shut-ins, et cetera, which we'll talk about in a moment. All right, so it is 10 o'clock. Is that right? So let's talk about kind of more modern times here. Some of you younger folks, if there are any younger folks in here, you're like, why are you talking about the 1960s? That was like 2,000 years ago. Let's shift the gears into the more modern times, okay? Basically, in the 1960s, we developed Thorazine, which is an antipsychotic, and we developed it in a form that allows you to give a shot in the butt that lasts for 3 weeks. Prior to that, if you were schizophrenic, you heard voices telling you that people were trying to kill you or you should kill other people or what have you, which still happens, you had to take your pill every single day. And if you didn't take it, you decompensated and you were committed to a mental institution or what have you. So in the 60s, when Thorazine was developed, people said, hey, we don't have to put people in these mental institutions. We can just give them the shot in a community psychiatric center, outpatient center, and they can blend in with society like everybody else. And we don't have to pay for all these mental, acute and long-term psychiatric hospitals. And so what we did in America is we deinstitutionalized the mentally ill. We turned them out on the street. And President JFK signed legislation to allow for the building of community health centers where they would go and get these Thorazine shots and theoretically be functional, contributing members of society. Well, in North Carolina, we didn't really build all those community centers. That didn't really happen. And really, through a lot of the country, that didn't happen like it was supposed to either. And from experience, there's always going to be a certain segment of society that cannot function with the rest of us. And it's naive to think that we can expect them to function like us, to secure a cell phone, to navigate the internet, to be able to pay their bills on time to Duke Energy and to Spectrum Internet and to whatever, and keep up with all the responsibilities that we have to. I mean, some of you folks in here moved here probably realize it's really hard just to figure out how to get your power turned on to your house. I mean, that stuff like that. We live in a complex society. There's always going to be a group of people that cannot do that, and they need help. But we've turned them out on the street. And that was classically portrayed in the movie One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Now, that movie didn't come out till 1975. We were already way ahead of, or in the midst of turning people out on the street by then. But that kind of sealed the deal when Jack Nicholson portrayed his lovable character that everybody fell in love with, and Nurse Ratched was just portrayed as this evil psychiatric nurse. And the whole institution, after you watch the movie, you're like, yeah, this is terrible. And we know as believers, we live in a fallen world. We're always going to need checks and balances. There are always going to be abuses, but that doesn't mean you throw the baby out with the bathwater. So, we've turned our mentally ill out onto the street, and they can't function in society. So we have a rapid increase in the homelessness, and then we go from having the hippies smoking pot in the 60s to morphing into heroin use to then saying, you know what, it's just too labor intensive to grow heroin and to get it into a form that's easily injectable. We're just going to go in a lab with a few chemicals and make fentanyl. And so now we've moved on from fentanyl. Some places like Seattle have moved on to trank, which is an animal, a horse tranquilizer that's being used. So we have become professionals at substance use. And so when you're mentally ill, it's easy to do both. And we call that in medicine a dual diagnosis. When you're drug addicted and you're mentally ill, you have a dual diagnosis. And we don't know what to do with people like you. So we just stick you in the ER until we find a bed for you when you decompensate. And then, because we don't have any mental health hospitals, because we shut them all down and made Dorothea Dix into a park in Raleigh, you're going to sit in the ER for days, sometimes weeks at a time. Now, if I take a normal person and I put you in an emergency room for about 3 days, I'll make you go crazy. And if you're already crazy, you're going to be even crazier. So one of the things we learned real quick is you don't turn your back in the emergency room when there's a psych room a padded room, especially with somebody in 4-point restraints. Don't turn your back on that room. So a lot of our social ills are self-induced, and we have to recognize that. I'm getting ahead of my story. I'll slow down. So then we move into basically the 80s, and we enter the non-profit era, where people are looking around like, all right, we got all these social ills. Churches aren't doing anything other than serving soup and maybe a cot on a cold night. We got to do some long-term solutions here. So we have all these nonprofits that are rising, and along with that, everybody's getting involved and giving in charity. Being charitable, corporations are getting involved. It's hip, it's cool. We're going to give to this charity and that charity. And then we start seeing what we call what Robert Lupton calls the rise of toxic charity. This is something we're reading about. What in the world is that? How can giving to the poor be toxic? Well, he makes the case in this point, and this is something that we hope that as a church we can all read together. The MOT is reading it now. He makes the point that a lot of the times our well-meaning giving ends up causing this natural transition from being grateful and thankful to being expectant, to creating this pathological relationship of entitlement. And so he gives example after example after example of well-meaning charitable institutions and churches doing things that will rob the recipient of their dignity, creates this abnormal relationship where you have a superior and inferior role, and it never transitions to a peer-to-peer role where we're equals. And that's one of the things that we want to try and avoid with our mercy ministry. You will be seeing, and probably have been seeing locally in New Hanover County, calls by certain people involved with ministering to the homeless for churches to step up and do their part. For instance, one leader in this community wants churches to turn their parking lots into places where folks who have a car but are homeless can park, and to put a mobile shower unit or a porta-john in there, so and not have their cars towed away. Well, there are problems with that. But let me go back to one thing, and that's our North Carolina history, church history. Because we never really had an organized church that through the centuries was skilled at ministering to the poor, we've always been taking care of the poor from a secular perspective. So our churches have never really been trained or developed on how to minister to the world in an effective way in North Carolina. That's my argument. I'm not trying to push that as though that's fact. That's just my observation from what I've read and experienced by being a citizen here for all but 2 years of my life. So to expect local churches to shift gears from what they're doing to taking care of extremely mentally ill, not everybody who's homeless is mentally ill. There's a large percentage, but not everybody. But to taking care of folks who have complex problems without training is unrealistic. And And it's gonna lead to pathological relationships, and it's going to probably cause more harm than good if you don't start out doing it right. Mr. Lupton basically says it's harder to undo a pathological giving relationship when you minister to the poor than it is to start right in the first place. So we have the luxury, praise the Lord, of being somewhat new to this community and trying to start something right rather than jumping into and creating something that is pathological and something that we're spending all of our efforts trying to undo. Now, what's happening across the nation? A lot of churches you know and read about are involved. I'm getting ahead of myself. So we have like these models here where you have simple, like, kind of the most simple thing when ministering to the poor might be, having people sit down and present the gospel, and then, okay, we're going to have a food pantry and people can go through and get the food they need. This kind of like not uncommon. You'll see a lot. You'll see that a lot in the rural areas. For instance, New Bern, about 20 years ago, created a co-op. A bunch of churches came together because each church by itself was pretty small. They just didn't have the resources, so they developed. It morphed into a nonprofit food pantry, basically. I don't know if the gospel is preached within that system, but that's sort of like the most simple system that a lot of churches go towards or will start. And then you have churches that go all the way to the other end of the spectrum, and they have grant workers on their staff. They have interns, paid interns, say college folks trying to beef up their resume. They're coming in and tutoring or something like that. That would be like that's kind of that's a typo. It should say El Cuerpo. I apologize. So we support El Cuerpo through the Mercy Outreach Team, and that's a ministry out of Christ Community, our brothers and sisters across town. I was briefly involved with that very early on. We started just going to the Royal Palms Trailer Park on Carolina Beach Road and would just do a simple vacation Bible school for the Hispanic kids. And that was probably 10 plus years ago. Now, that is a full-blown ministry where they tutor the Hispanic kids, come over after school, they get tutored. The women, Hispanic women, have Bible studies because a lot of them are depressed because they're isolated. They have a medical clinic because diabetes is so rampant in the Hispanic community. They have a full-time administrator who's paid. The hospital foundation, when Novant bought New Hanover, I don't know, Andrew, 5 years ago? About 5 years ago, they paid like $1.9 billion. Big uproar in the community. A lot of people didn't want to have it happen. I won't go into that. That money is sitting there to be used for charitable purposes. And so the hospital and Christ Community partnered up, and they were able to get a grant so that some of these Hispanic folks can come to the El Cuerpo Medical Clinic. And the hospital would far rather have them go to El Cuerpo than to clog up the ER that's already over capacity, even though it tripled in size 7-8 years ago or something like that. Even after we tripled the size of it, the next day we're still putting people out in the hallway because there still wasn't enough room because of all the retirees moving here. I say that tongue in cheek. We just didn't keep up with the population explosion. So, El Cuerpo? Okay, great. Yeah. So anyway, that's an example from the very simple charity, food pantry, all the way to the complex where you got grants and you got full-time employees. And so there are some churches, that are doing these ministries across the country, either food pantries or things like El Cuerpo. And so they're targeting things like food insecurity, homelessness, disaster relief at Saddleback, which has multiple locations in California. And so they have a logistical network. They have transportation vehicles. But what I want to focus on for Saddleback is mobilization of thousands of trained volunteers. See, that's what's critical. Like, if you decide you're going to get in mercy ministry, it is not going to be helpful to throw somebody into the frying pan without any training. So we have to train ourselves or be trained by someone how to reach out to the community, because it's difficult, and it needs to be done the right way. So that's Saddleback, and then these are just like simple examples. There's a church in Arkansas, not a wealthy state, so they focus on job programs and transportation assistance, addressing child care barriers. And so, they're trying to address root causes, not only immediate needs. So they kind of move beyond like the food pantry thing to, okay, let's figure out why some of our people are really struggling and address the root cause here. So these are some of the themes that you're starting to see in modern day mercy ministry. You're starting to see partnerships with social services. Like this is not necessarily a church example, but I'll give you an example of what we as a community decided to do because we have such a homeless problem, is, and I think wisely so, the county commissioners decided, all right, we're going to pay for a social worker to ride along in the squad car whenever there is a complaint about a homeless person and the police have to go and investigate. We're gonna put a social worker in the squad car, because most of the time that homeless person doesn't need the police officer. They need some help. And so a lot of times they can de-escalate the situation by having the social worker. But you're starting to see, in terms of church mercy ministry, partnerships with social services, churches working alongside other churches, volunteer training systems, people deciding, okay, look, this is our community, this is where God planted us, so we're going to be here for the long term, so we're going to figure out how to serve the poor in our community, and we're going to stick it out with them. Churches are becoming resource hubs. And so these are some of the themes that we're starting to see in the 2000s with church charity. Again, little or no gospel proclamation in a lot of these programs. A lot of them morph to a humanitarian focus. There's a church in San Francisco called, is it Glide or Guild or something. I went through their website the other day. They have thousands of people there. They do a lot of great stuff. I didn't see one word, I didn't see one mention of Jesus in the whole website. Nothing, no scripture, nothing about the Bible, nothing. So that's, again, I'm going to keep harping on that because that's what we've got to hold on to. We don't want to engage in mission creep. Okay, so key question here. How do we maintain gospel clarity? How How do we practice faithful mercy ministry? How do we engage in partnerships without losing our theological identity? Thankfully, in 2018, Jim Petty started the Mercy, proposed the Mercy Outreach Team to the deacons. Mercy Outreach Team, we're basically just an extension of the deacons. And that was during our church plant era. We weren't even a particularized church then, but fortunately, Jim had the foresight to say, hey, right off the bat, we need to make sure that this third leg of the ministry is included, ministry to the world. And so fortunately, he with Erica and some other folks, Kevin Whitley, who's not in the room presently, were able to create the Mercy Outreach Team. Thank you, Virginia. These are our founding documents. They discuss the vision, our purpose, and sort of our mode of operation. And fortunately, this is what was formulated. Number one, if we're going to engage in ministry to the community, it's going to be gospel-centered. People are going to hear the good news of Jesus Christ. It's going to be theologically aligned, hopefully. Hopefully, we're going to have a person who has a personal connection with that ministry. For instance, she's not here anymore, but when she was here, many of you know Lambeth Chalk. She's gotten married. I don't know her last name now, but she was very fluent in Spanish, and she had a heart for the Hispanics. So she became our representative liaison to El Cuerpo through the Mercy Outreach Team. So we could keep tabs on what's happening at El Cuerpo through Lambeth. Holly Burris and my wife, and David Burris especially, have a personal connection to Lifeline Pregnancy Center. And so we are able to be in contact with them. We know what's going on over there. And we know that the gospel is going to be preached. People are going to get really good qualified services. So we started out, we being MOT, basically writing checks. And that's what we do now. And every year, fortunately, because you all are so generous, we're giving more and more each year. But we're a particularized church now. And we have a pastor now. So we're growing up. We're starting to be mature here. We're starting to move on from just being a church plant who was trying to find its sea legs and then got knocked down by COVID and then knocked down by a change in pastoral leadership to, okay, now we're where a lot of us wanted to be 10 years ago. But through certain circumstances, it just took a while to get here. So here we are, and we want to try and do this right. So here we are in Belvedere. This place has different names. It's called Belvedere, this neighborhood. Some people call it Barkley Hills. Some people call it Carolina Heights. Some people call it the north side, the north of Wilmington. Basically, the government looks at us, Census Tract 103, pretty, about 27% poverty rate, mostly blue collar. Does include Creekwood, which is our low-income, high-crime housing development. That, by the way, a lot of churches in town have tried to impact and failed. So you want to do your homework before you try and do something. I'm not saying don't do anything. You just want to do some you want to do some research before you do something like that. So here we are. We have these 4 ministries that we give to. We don't have a lot of volunteer involvement within these. Some of it beyond our control, some of it not so. For instance, Lifeline now is mostly using paid college interns. There may be some volunteer opportunities for a non-professional person. I'm not sure. El Cuerpo. Why am I hovering over Lifeline? Lifeline, not a whole lot of volunteer opportunities there. There's a possibility we could adopt a single woman who's pregnant and help her. We have some privacy issues we'd have to sort through. These are just kind of ideas off the top of my head, okay? We could form a team here and walk through the pregnancy with some of these ladies and minister to them that way. Calvary Christian we've been involved with. Jim Petty spoke last year on probably the most effective way to impact the poor in a community is through quality Christian education. I mean, even the Bolsheviks recognized you want to change, have an impact on your culture, you get a hold of the kids. So Calvary Christian isn't teaching communism. I'm just saying that's how you want to really have an impact, do something for the kids and make it. Yeah, thank you, Jim. Yeah. So next week you'll get to hear all about that. And then the fourth ministry that we are partnered with is Vigilant Hope. Randy is our liaison there. And that's a learning curve. He's learning, we're learning how to minister to the homeless. And it's very complex, it's very difficult. And again, because churches in North Carolina were never really equipped or set up for doing that. So it's going to be everybody, if we do anything with that, everybody here is going to be learning on the fly. So and they're having sort of a vision, not a vision, but a little bit of change in their execution of their ministry, I should say. So we're still waiting to hear exactly what the outcome of that is going to be. So I talked about the financial giving here. My recommendations basically moving forward, and they're just my recommendations. Again, I'm not leadership here. We identify this community and their needs and let the community also identify what their needs are. This community that we're in right now, sitting in, probably 97% of you don't live in it. There are only 3 or 4 couples, maybe 3, that live within a 2-mile radius of this church. So this is a destination church. A lot of you drive in here because you're PCAers or you're coming here because you have friends here or what have you, but you're not living in this neighborhood, most of you. So it's going to be tricky from that standpoint. Most effective ministries have members living within the community, but we can let the community determine what their needs are. We already know it's a food desert, meaning it's a long drive. It's a long way to go get groceries from here. It's an educational desert. Our elementary school over here, Rachel Freeman, is grade F. No matter how much money is thrown at it, it continues to be grade F, so money's not the answer. It's a counseling desert. As Jim was pointing out to me last week, there's probably a high rate of domestic discord here, marital discord, family discord. So it's probably a counseling desert. Transportational desert for a lot of people, most likely. Not able to have good transportation. We live in a car-based society. You can't get somewhere, you can't have a job, you're not going to get a paycheck. It's one of those deals. So, we've got to identify what the community needs. Let the community identify what it needs. Ask the people here, what do you need? Or do you know, if your neighbor needs the stuff, or what do they need? How can we come alongside people in this community? And then we got to figure out, okay, how are we going to do this with it being gospel-centered? Because this is so easy for me to grab 3 or 4 guys and go build a ramp for a lady that just had a hip repair and is coming home in a wheelchair, and she doesn't have any kids. She lives alone. She's a shut-in. We can go build a ramp. That's easy. But how are we going to do this? And okay, we're not going to really do anything unless first and foremost we're able to share the good news of who Christ is. So that's where we are. I'm going to stop here, take questions, comments, verbal abuse from the crowd. Yep. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. Yeah, he is sinking a lot of money into this area. For you new folks, North Carolina, Michael Jordan grew up here, high school at Laney, went on to Chapel Hill, and then obviously Chicago Bulls championships, etc. His mom is still here. His dad was killed on I-40 by two guys years ago when his dad was pulled over to get some shut-eye, was sleepy. So Michael lives in Charlotte now, I believe, but still has ties here. So he's opening 2 or 3 clinics in conjunction with Novant. Well, basically Novant's opening them. The tricky thing about this will be, it's easy to open up a medical clinic with a big chunk of change, somebody writing a big fat check. 5 years from now, because almost all those patients will be Medicaid-based, which does not generally pay for your overhead for a medical office. Most of those offices will most likely be struggling financially, and Novant will be having to make decisions on taking money from a profitable center, say the surgical realm, and shift it inpatient surgical realm, and then subsidize the outpatient clinics. And then it'll get to the point where they're like, okay, how long or how much are we going to keep doing this? So I'm glad he's putting it up, especially one right outside Creekwood. I'm glad they're doing that. But it'll be interesting to see in 5-10 years from now what really happens in terms of the day-to-day financing of it. What else? What other questions may have been piqued by some of my provocative statements?